At their peak, the Spartans were one of the most fearsome races in the ancient world. They had many enemies, but today we are going to focus on one, which is Messenia. Hello and welcome to our channel. Today we are going to tell you guys about the First Messenian War, which began in 743 BC and ended in 724 BC. So, let's take a trip down the bloody annals of history. Before the return of the Heracleidae in 1104, the Peloponnese was Achaean. Later, the region was split between the three victorious Dorian commanders who were Heracleids. Aristobulus captured Sparta, Temenus took Argos, and Chersophontes conquered Messenia. The Helots, Messena's former reigning dynasty, had gone to Athens with the Atrides, kings of Mycenae and Argos. Sparta, a tiny state east of the middle Eurotas Valley, was colonized by the Dorians during the time. Sparta was left in the hands of Aristophanes' twin boys, who were controlled by a Theban regent, Thyras, their mother's brother. Thyras led a colony to Thera once the twins became majority. Meanwhile, once Chersophontes married Merope, daughter of Cypselus, king of Arcadia and an Achaean, the Messenians acknowledged him as king. Another Dorian enclave in Messenia received some of their territories. Following this, the Achaean noble families mounted an uprising, assassinating Chersophontes and all of his sons but one in a single coup. Epidus, the eldest, was in Arcadia receiving his education. When Epidus reached maturity, the rulers of Sparta, Dorians, Argos, Dorian, and Arcadia restored him in Achaean. Except for the regicides who were killed, the Messenian nobility was conquered via gifts and generosity. Epidus created the Epididae, a Messene dynasty of rulers. The Heracleid ancestors were purposely omitted from the family tree. Epididae were completely absorbed into the Achaean culture. They claimed the old Achaean and Pelasgian sanctuary on Mount Ithome's peak as their own and forced the Dorians to worship there as well. Finally, under King Fintus, they attended the annual Apollo celebration at Delos, the most significant festival in place of devotion for the Ionians, the Achaeans' descendants. The Dorians in Messenia were enraged by this Achaeanizing. By right of conquering, they saw themselves as superior to the Achaeans. Sparta, which had maintained a prosperous Dorian enclave, eventually gaining ascendancy over the Achaeans in the Eurotas Valley, who became the Perioeci, backed them up in this perspective. An event of violence that happened 25 years previous to the First Messenian War, during a festival at the Temple of Artemis Limnatis around 768 BC, exemplifies the deep ethnic enmity and disagreement that existed between the Dorians and the Achaeans. This was the year when Messenia was invited to an Ionian celebration by King Fintus, who was regarded as a Dorian by the Dorians. Only Messenians and Laconians worshipped at the temple, which was located on the boundary between Messenia and Laconia. Artemis, Apollo's sister, was a popular deity among the Messenian Greeks for a long time. Two versions of the tale are told by Pausanias. The Spartan legend describes the raping of virgins and the assassination of Teleclos, the Aegean line's monarch at Sparta. In Greece, festivals and temples were considered sacrosanct and held on the hallowed territory. Even persecuted men may seek safety in a temple due to the prohibition on violence. The Spartan account doesn't explain why the Messenians came to worship and then started raping and murdering on holy land. According to the Messenian legend, the virgins were beardless warriors masquerading as women under the command of Teleclos, and the soldiers' goal was to get near to the Messenian nobility in order to assassinate them. Because the shrine was an Achaean center rather than a Dorian one, religious issues may not have been taken into account. The Messenian commanders quickly drove them off and killed their commander because the men chosen for their beardlessness were too inexperienced. A generation later, this hate of the Laconians and the Messenians would come to a head. An incident of livestock theft served as the initial trigger. Polychares of Messenia, an Olympian, rented some grazing ground from Euphinos the Spartan, who soon sold the animals to some merchants, alleging they had been taken by pirates. As he was making explanations to Polychares, a herdsman of the latter interfered, having escaped the merchants, to inform his master of the truth. Euphinos apologized and requested Polychares to allow his son to accompany him to the sale to get the money. But once over the Spartan border, he murdered the son. Polychares sought justice from the Spartan magistrates. He became despondent and began murdering Spartans he could find at random. This enraged Sparta, which demanded his extradition, but Messenia denied the request. Spartans decided to go to war without the normal heraldic notification or any other warning to the Messenians, having run out of legal remedies for the killings of their compatriots. Alcmenes gathered a force. When it was finished, they made a promise not to stop fighting until they had conquered Messenia, regardless of how long the war lasted or how many lives were lost. The Spartan raid on Amphya, a city now lost to history, but most likely on Taygetus' western flank, was the opening fight of the war. They arrived at the gates, which were open after a fast night march. There was no garrison, and no one anticipated them to arrive. The Spartans waking people out of bed to murder them was the first clue the Amphians had of war. Others ran for their lives, taking sanctuary in temples. After sacking the city, the Spartans transformed it into a garrison to pursue additional operations against Messenia. Women and children from Messenia were kidnapped. The men who had survived were sold as slaves. When word of Amphia traveled across Messenia, a mob gathered in Sthenocleros, the capital. Euphanes the king delivered a speech to them. He urged them to remain genuine men in the face of adversity, reminding them that justice and the gods were on their side because they did not attack first. Following that, he armed the whole populace and organized for their training. Euphanes depended on fixed fortifications from the start. He built and garrisoned the cities while avoiding incursions into Spartan territory. The Spartans looted the transportable riches for 2 more seasons, seizing food and money in particular, but were instructed to save capital assets such as buildings and trees, which may be useful after the war. The Spartans could never successfully siege any of the fortified locations in this matrix. The Messenians could only attack undefended Spartan border settlements when the chance arose, since they refused to confront the main Spartan force. Euphanes determined to carry the war to the Spartans at Amphia in the 4th campaigning season, or in the summer of 739 according to Pausanias' dating method. He declared to let loose the full blast of Messenian anger. The Messenians were denied access to the countryside for agricultural purposes by the Spartans. The following events demonstrate that the Messenians' denial was unworkable in the long run. They needed to deal a decisive blow to the Spartans' existence in their nation. Euphanes believed that his troops had received adequate training to combat the Spartan professional warriors. He organized an expedition and marched out of the city in the direction of Amphia. The transfer of wood and all the stuff for stockades on his luggage train indicates that his primary priority was to build a fortified outpost closer to Amphibia. There is no indication of any intelligence about the Spartan army's current situation. He didn't act like a commander who was anticipating a war that day. His intention had to be to bring the starting line of future attacks closer to the enemy, a conventional technique afterward utilized with great success by the Roman army. The Spartans, on the other hand, were keeping a close eye on him. They promptly dispatched troops from Sparta who marched straight for the enemy, coming face to face with the Messenians halfway between Ithome and Taygetus. Euphase was not surprised by their approach. He chose a place with one side abutting an impassable gorge between the Messenians and the Spartans after great consideration. Many have questioned Euphase's choice to station his army in that specific location, but a look at subsequent events makes things clearer. Euphase wanted to construct a fortified camp, and he did so. The primary purpose of locating such a camp is to prevent enemy access. Euphase was well understood by the Spartan leaders. They dispatched a force upstream to bridge the valley and outflank the Messenians, preventing them from erecting a camp, but Euphase had foreseen this maneuver. They prevented the Spartans from crossing the ravine by following them down the opposite side with 500 cavalry and light infantry under Pythoratos and Antandros. The camp was completed the next day. Now blocked, the Spartan army was forced to withdraw from Messenia. Both sides were aware that a significant battle would be fought during the following campaigning season. Meanwhile, Alcmedes died at Sparta and was succeeded by his son Polydorus. The Messenian fortified camp was led by Cleonis. He moved his command to the east at the start of the season to face a Spartan army heading west from Sparta. They met in the plains under Taygetus at an unnamed Messenian spot, maybe near Amphia. The conflict was mostly fought by heavy infantry. Pausanias uses the phrases light infantry and infantry interchangeably. The Spartan army was mostly made up of infantry. Dryopians, an ethnic group of Pelasgians whose ancestors had been driven from Dryopia by the Dorians, who renamed it Doris, and from their Achaean refuge Achaean when Dorian Argos subjugated it, were there as light infantry. Dorian Sparta eventually granted them protection. The Spartans were the ones who drew these up. A detachment of Cretan archers was also present. The light forces had little role in the combat and were mostly observers. In customary start lines, the two armies faced each other. Cleonis took leadership of the Messenian center, while Euphase commanded the left flank with Antandros and the right flank with Pythartos. Euryleon, a noble Spartan, and a Cadmid stood in front of Cleonis, with Polydorus on his left and Theopompus on his right. In this tirade, the latter invoked grandeur, fortune, and the oath they had all sworn. Euphase opted to depict death or servitude, alluding to Amphia's destiny. On both sides, the signal to advance was issued at the same time. The battle ended in a victory for the Spartans, as their well-coordinated and trained militia was more than a match for the uncoordinated Messenians. Instead of advancing as a joint unit, many of the Messenian soldiers broke rank and charged towards the Spartans, where they were cut down one by one. Some historians say that some of the Messenians were successful in this approach and performed great acts of heroism, but none of them could change their impending defeat. According to the records, the Spartans used a phalanx formation during the battle, but historians dispute this claim, since they believe that the phalanx formation only came into use in the Second Messenian War. But whatever the case, the battle was a resounding victory for the Spartans. The Messenians retreated to the well-guarded Mount Ithome, not wanting to face another war like this. This was the first time the Messenians sought assistance from the oracle at Delphi. They were told that sacrificing a royal virgin was the key to their success, and that the sacrifice would be made by the daughter of Aristobulus, a Messenian hero. When the Spartans learned of this, they delayed assaulting Ithome for several years until ultimately marching under their monarchs and slaying the Messenian commander. The new Messenian monarch, Aristobulus, conducted an onslaught against the enemies, forcing them back into their own realm. The Spartans dispatched an ambassador to Delphi, and their acceptance of her advice resulted in such severe Messenian reversals that Aristobulus committed suicide and Ithome fell. Messenians who had barricaded themselves on the mountain were either captured or enslaved. Those who managed to escape fled abroad. Sparta, under the authority of a diarchy, swiftly gained riches and culture, with the socio-economic underpinning of classical Sparta developing from this conflict and growth. A helot insurrection sparked the Second Messenian War in 685 BC. So that is all the time we had today, folks. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to watch more of our amazing videos, then do hit the subscribe button. And also, do not forget to hit the bell icon to receive instant notifications from our side. See you all next time, folks.